Romper Room, where we ball a break. Big wins, big losses, all at stake. Party vibe, poker life, always crunk. Feel rich, feel broke, that's just the funk, yeah. Seen boys rise, seen boys fall. Bluffing stacks, risking it all. Got the queens, thought I locked the pot. Straight flush flip, now I'm feeling shot. It's the hustle, it's the grind, no time to assume. All in a fold, life in the romper room.
What's up, you filthy animals? Welcome back to the Romper Room Poker Podcast. Huge congrats to Alex Cantu and Henry Martinez for absolutely crushing that heads-up tournament. I mean, seriously, those guys played like goddamn sharks.
Yeah, they were on fire for sure.
Okay, so we've been getting a ton of questions from listeners about heads-up strategy, and honestly, it makes sense, right? It's a completely different animal compared to your typical ring game.
Oh, absolutely.
It's way more intense, right? Like, every decision just feels magnified.
It really is. The whole dynamic changes when you're only going up against one other person. It becomes this like super intense mental battle where you're trying to outsmart and outplay each other every step of the way.
Totally. And the stakes are just way higher, right? I mean, every single decision has a huge impact on the hand and obviously the whole match.
For sure. In a ring game, you can be a lot more patient. Wait for premium hands, pick your spots carefully. But heads up, you have to be aggressive. Put the pressure on your opponent and keep them guessing what you're going to do next.
So you're saying tight passive play is basically a death sentence in heads up?
Pretty much, yeah. If you're just sitting there waiting for pocket aces, you're going to get steamrolled. You need to be willing to play a wider range of hands bluff more often and really figure out how to exploit your opponent's weaknesses.
Okay, that makes sense. But wouldn't playing more hands also increase the risk of getting caught with your pants down?
Of course, there's always some risk involved, but that's where hand selection comes in and really understanding your opponent's tendencies. You don't want to just raise any two cards, but you also can't be too scared to mix it up.
Gotcha. So let's talk about pre-flop strategy for a minute. Something I've always been curious about is how much emphasis should we put on position in heads up? Because in a ring game, position is obviously king, but in heads up, you're either on the button or in the big blind, so does it really matter as much?
It still matters, but it's not as clear-cut as in a ring game. Obviously, being on the button gives you a huge advantage because you get to act last post-flop. But even in the big blind, you can't just be a pushover. You need to be aggressive and defend your blinds effectively.
Okay, so what kind of hands should we be defending our big blind with against a button raise? Are we literally calling with anything?
God, no. You gotta have some standards, man.
Yeah.
But you also don't want to fold to every raise. I think a good rule of thumb is to defend with any two cards that have decent equity against the button's likely opening range.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice? Like ace-10, king-jack, queen-10 suited. That kind of stuff.
Yeah, those are all pretty solid starting hands. You also want to sprinkle in some suited connectors like 8-9 suited, 7-8 suited, even 6-7 suited sometimes. These hands have a lot of potential to flop straights or flushes, and they can be really profitable if you hit the right board.
So we're not just chilling waiting for premiums. We're playing a wider range, mixing it up, and being aggressive, especially from the button.
Exactly. You got to keep the pressure on your opponent and make them uncomfortable.
Okay, cool. Now, what about 3-betting? Is that something we should be doing a lot in heads up, or are we mostly just calling raises and seeing flops?
Oh, 3-betting is definitely a key weapon in your heads-up arsenal. It lets you build the pot pre-flop, put pressure on your opponent, and potentially steal the blinds right away.
So when should we be 3-betting? Just premium hands, or are we mixing in some bluffs too?
You definitely want to have a balanced 3-betting range, just like in any other format. That means a mix of strong hands for value, like aces, kings, queens, ace-king, and some bluffs to keep your opponent guessing.
All right, so how do we decide which hands to bluff with? It seems pretty risky to be 3-betting with air in heads up.
It is risky, but it's also a necessary part of the game if you want to win. The key is to pick your spots carefully and choose hands that have at least some potential to improve on the flop, like suited aces or suited connectors.
So we're not just like randomly 3-betting with 7-deuce offsuit.
No. There needs to be a reason behind your bluffs, even if it's just the potential to hit a lucky flop.
Okay, got it. So pre-flop in heads up is all about aggression, playing a wide range and putting pressure on our opponent. But what about once we see the flop? How do we navigate those post-flop streets?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Post-flop play. in heads up is a whole different ballgame. You got to be even more adaptable, more deceptive, and more willing to mix up your strategies.
So we can't just stick to one style of play like being super aggressive or super passive.
Exactly. You got to be like a chameleon, constantly changing your colors to blend in with the situation.
Okay, I like that analogy. So let's talk about some specific post-flop concepts. One thing that always trips me up is continuation betting. Should we be c-betting a lot in heads up, or are we checking more often to trap our opponent?
It depends. You got to consider the board texture, your opponent's tendencies, and your own hand strength. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Okay, well, let's break it down a little. Let's say the flop comes ace-king-5 rainbow. I'm on the button and I raise pre-flop. Should I be c-betting there?
In that spot, yeah, I'd probably c-bet a decent amount of the time. You have a strong range advantage on that board, and your opponent is likely to have a lot of air in their range.
So I'm betting to represent a strong hand like ace-king or a set.
Right. You're trying to take down the pot right there or force your opponent to fold a weaker hand.
Makes sense. But what if the flop comes something like 10-8 deuce with 2 hearts? Now it seems like the big blind has a lot more potential to connect with the flop. Should I still be c-betting?
It's definitely trickier on a board like that. You have to be more cautious because your opponent could easily have flopped a pair, a straight draw, or even a flush draw.
So should I just check and give like the initiative?
Not necessarily. You can still c-bet some of the time, especially if you have a decent hand yourself, like top pair or a strong draw. But you also want to mix in some checks to keep your opponent guessing and not be too predictable.
Okay. I'm starting to see how complex this post-flop game can get. It's not just about blindly betting or checking. It's about analyzing the situation, reading your opponent, and making the best decision based on the information you have.
Exactly. You got to use your brain out there, man. Don't just be a robot.
All right, so we talked about c-betting. What about other post-flop plays like check raising? Is that something we should be doing frequently in heads up?
Check raising is a powerful tool in heads up for sure, but you got to use it wisely. It's not something you want to be doing every single hand.
So when should we be check raising? Are we looking for specific situations, or is it more of a feel thing?
It's a little bit of both. There are definitely some situations where check raising is more effective, like when you have a really strong hand and you want to build a big pot, or when you're on a draw heavy board and you want to represent a strong made hand.
Okay, let's say the flop comes king, queen, jack with 2 spades. I'm in the big blind, and I checked, and my opponent bets. Should I be check raising there?
That could be a good spot to check raise, especially if you have a hand like a set 2 pair, or even just a strong draw like ace-10 of spades.
So I'm check raising to represent a monster hand and potentially win the pot right there, or at least get more value if my opponent has a weaker hand.
Right. You're putting maximum pressure on your opponent and forcing them to make a tough decision.
Gotcha. But what if I don't have a strong hand? Can I still check raise as a bluff?
You can, but you got to be careful. Bluffing in heads up is way riskier than in a ring game because you're putting your whole stack on the line.
So I shouldn't be check raising with just any 2 cards.
Definitely not. You want to choose your bluffing spots carefully and make sure you're representing a hand that makes sense.
Okay, so let's say the flop comes 7-6 deuce rainbow. I'm on the button, I c-bet, and my opponent check raises. Should I be folding there?
It really depends on your hand and how your opponent has been playing. If you have a weak hand like ace high or a weak pair, you're probably better off folding. But if you have a decent hand like top pair or a strong draw, you might want to consider calling or even re-raising.
So it's not an automatic fold just because they check raise?
Nope. You got to use your judgment and make the best decision based on the information you have.
Man, this is making my head spin a little. There's so much to think about in heads-up play. It's like chess on steroids.
Yeah, it can be mentally demanding, for sure. That's why mastering the mental game is just as important as understanding the technical aspects of the game. You got to be able to handle the swings, avoid tilt, and stay focused, even when things aren't going your way.
Easier said than done, right? But I guess that's what separates the pros from the amateurs. They have that mental toughness that lets them stay calm and collected under pressure.
Absolutely. And part of that mental toughness comes from understanding variance. Heads up is a high variance game, which means you're going to experience some crazy swings both up and down. The key is to not let those swings affect your decision making.
So basically, you got to embrace the suck and ride the wave, knowing that in the long run, the math will even out.
Exactly. It's like a roller coaster. You're going to have those heart-stopping drops and those exhilarating climbs. But as long as you keep your hands inside the car, you'll make it to the end of the ride.
And hopefully have a big stack of chips waiting for you when you get there.
That's the goal, my friend. That's the goal. You know, another super important aspect of the mental game that we haven't really talked about yet is bluffing. It's something that a lot of players really struggle with, but it's absolutely crucial to winning at poker, especially in heads up.
Yeah, bluffing can be scary as hell. It's like walking a tightrope without a net.
But I get why it's important. If you never bluff, your opponents will just call you down with any decent hand.
Precisely. A good bluff can win you a pot when you have absolutely nothing, and it can also make your value bets more effective. If your opponent thinks you might be bluffing, they're more likely to pay you off when you actually have a strong hand.
Okay, so how do you actually get better at bluffing? Is it just something you're born with, or can you actually train that bluffing muscle, as Doug Polk calls it?
Oh, it's definitely something you can train. It's all about understanding when and how to bluff effectively. One thing that's really helped me is to run through hand scenarios in my head and think about what my opponent's range might be and how they might react to different bet sizes. So you're basically practicing your bluffing skills away from the table, kind of like a basketball player practicing free throws.
Exactly. The more you think about bluffing and try to identify good bluffing spots, the more comfortable you'll become with it in real game situations.
Makes sense. And I guess that ties into the whole concept of lifelong learning in poker. You're never really a finished product. There's always something new to learn and improve on.
Couldn't agree more. The game is always evolving. New strategies are being developed, and players are always finding new ways to exploit each other. If you want to stay ahead of the curve, you got to be a student of the game, always seeking out new information and refining your skills.
Man, that's a lot to take in. It's starting to feel like I need to go back to poker school after this conversation.
Hey, we're all students of the game no matter how experienced we are. There's always something new to learn, some new angle to explore. That's what keeps poker so damn interesting.
And speaking of exploring new angles, let's talk about exploiting our opponent's weaknesses. I mean, heads up is all about finding that one chink in their armor and hammering it relentlessly right.
You got it. The key to exploiting weaknesses is to understand your opponent's tendencies, their opening ranges, how loose or tight they play, and how they react to different bet sizes.
So it's like building a psychological profile of your opponent, figuring out their fears and insecurities.
It's not quite that deep, but you're on the right track. The more you play against someone, the more you start to pick up on their patterns and tendencies. And once you've identified those weaknesses, you can start tailoring your strategy to exploit them.
Okay, give me an example. Let's say my opponent is a total calling station. They never fold to anything. How do I exploit that?
That's an easy one.
Huh?
You just value bet them relentlessly. Bet big on the flop turn and river and make sure they pay dearly for their loose play. You can even throw in a few bluffs here and there, knowing they're likely to call you down with bottom pair.
Damn, it sounds brutal, but effective.
Yeah.
What about the opposite scenario? What if my opponent is super tight? They only play premium hands.
Then you adjust your strategy accordingly. You tighten up your opening range bluff less often and focus on value betting your strong hands. You can also use smaller bet sizes to try and induce folds from their weaker holdings.
So basically, it's a constant game of cat and mouse, always trying to stay one step ahead of your opponent.
Well, that's a great way to put it. You got to be adaptable, always thinking about how your opponent is perceiving your play and what they might do next. And remember, you're not just trying to figure out what they have, but also how they think you're playing.
This is deep. Yeah. So we're not just playing against our opponent, but also against their perception of us.
Exactly. It's as much a mental battle as it is a strategic one. You got to get inside their heads, make them question their reads, and keep them guessing what you're going to do next.
Man, I need a break after this. My brain is fried.
I hear you. It's a lot to process, but the more you think about these concepts, the more natural they'll become in your game. And trust me, the rewards are definitely worth the effort.
All right, let's wrap up this pre-flop and mental game deep dive for now. Any final words of wisdom before we move on to post-flop strategy?
Just remember, heads up is a dynamic game that requires you to constantly adapt. You got to be willing to learn, experiment, and refine your strategies. And most importantly, don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how you learn and grow as a player.
Hell yeah. Mistakes are just lessons in disguise, really.
Yeah.
Now let's hear a word from our sponsors, and then we'll come back to break down post-flop play like bosses.
My name is Scott McGrath. The day before my 8th birthday, I fell in a pile of fire ants and suffered significant wounds on over 70% of my body. Since that day, I have made a solemn vow to kill every insect on planet Earth. I hate them with the passion of a religious zealot. Speaking of religion, of all the biblical plagues, I hate the locust plague the most. For the last 12 years, my white-hot rage has materialized in the form of my business, McGrath Pest Control. I have harnessed this unforgivable intolerance of insects and released the wrath of my fury on bugs in and around the homes of Houston. I will kill those bugs in any way that I can. Chemicals, my boot, my bare fist, or any other object that can end the life of an insect. Call 281-469-8240 and give me the honor of killing bugs at your house. I also hate rats and spiders. Go to McGrathPestControl.com.
Now let's get back to the actual nuts and bolts of post-flop play. We touched on c-betting, but there's a whole universe of stuff to cover there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. C-betting is really just the beginning. Post-flop in heads-up is where things get really tricky and where your ability to read your opponent and adapt your strategy becomes even more crucial. Okay, so let's dive into some of those tricky spots then. One thing I always struggle with is figuring out how to play when I totally whiff the flop. Like, let's say I raise pre-flop with ace-king. The flop comes 10 high with no draws, and my opponent just calls. What do I do?
Yeah, that's a classic spot that trips a lot of players up. You've got ace high, which looks decent on the surface, but it's actually pretty vulnerable and heads up. Your opponent could easily have a pair, and even if they don't, they could be drawing to a ton of hands that beat you.
So I shouldn't just fire a second barrel and hope they fold.
Not always. You can definitely bet again on the flop, but you need to think about the board texture and your opponent's tendencies. If the board is really dry and your opponent is passive, a second barrel might be a good play. But if the board is draw heavy or your opponent is aggressive, you might be better off checking and seeing what happens on the turn.
Right, so it's not always about being the aggressor. Sometimes it's better to just chill and let our opponent make the first move.
Exactly. You don't always have to be the one dictating the action. Sometimes it's more profitable to sit back, observe, and react to what your opponent is doing.
Okay, so let's flip the script. What if I'm the one who called the flop bet? Like, let's say my opponent c-bets the 10 high flop, and I've got like a weak pair sevens or something. What do I do then?
That's another tough spot for sure. You're obviously vulnerable with just a pair, but you don't want to just fold every time you're behind. You need to consider the board texture, your opponent's bet sizing, and how likely they are to be bluffing.
So if the board is draw heavy and my opponent bets big, I'm probably folding.
Most likely, yeah. Your opponent is probably representing a strong hand, and it's just too risky to call with a weak pair.
Okay, but what if the board is dry and they bet small?
That's when you might have a real decision to make. A small bet on a dry board can sometimes be a sign of weakness. Your opponent might be bluffing or trying to get value from a weaker hand, like ace high or a pair of nines.
So I might actually be ahead in that spot.
It's possible. You got to think about your opponent's tendencies and how often they bluff. If they're a total maniac who bluffs a lot, you might be able to call or even raise with your weak pair.
So it's not just about the cards we have. It's about understanding our opponent's range and putting them on a hand.
Exactly. You need to be thinking about what your opponent is likely to have, not just what you hope they have.
Dude, this is starting to feel like mind reading.
It's not quite mind reading, but it's definitely a skill that takes time and practice to develop. The more you play, the better you'll get at reading your opponents and putting them on ranges.
All right, let's switch gears for a minute and talk about bet sizing. We talked about it a little in the context of c-betting, but how do we decide on the right bet size on later streets like the turn and river?
Bet sizing on later streets is even more nuanced than on the flop. You got to think about the pot size, your hand strength, your opponent's perceived range, and how much value you want to extract or how much you need to protect your hand.
Okay, that's a lot of variables.
Well,
Can you give me some general guidelines?
Sure. One common rule of thumb is to bet around half the pot when you have a strong hand, and you want to get value and bet around 3/4 of the pot when you have a really strong hand, and you want to protect it from draws or potential bluffs.
Good. So like if the pot is $100 and I have a set on the turn, I should bet around 50.
Yeah, that's a reasonable starting point. But you might adjust your bet size based on your opponent's tendencies. If they're super loose and call a lot, you might bet even bigger. If they're tight and fold a lot, you might bet smaller.
Gotcha. That makes sense. But what about when we're bluffing? How do we decide on the right bet size when we're trying to represent a hand we don't actually have?
When you're bluffing, you generally want to bet bigger to make it more expensive for your opponent to call. You're trying to create fold equity, which means making your bet so big that your opponent has to fold even if they have a decent hand.
So if I'm bluffing on the river and the pot is $100, I might bet like 75 or even 100.
Exactly. You're basically putting your opponent to the test and making them make a really tough decision.
But isn't that super risky? What if they call?
It is risky, but that's the nature of bluffing. Sometimes you're going to get caught and lose a big pot, but if you're bluffing correctly, you should be winning more often than you lose.
Okay, so it's like a calculated risk.
Mm-hmm.
We're not just randomly firing off huge bets with air. We're picking our spots carefully and making sure our bluffs make sense.
Right. There needs to be a plan, a story you're telling with your bets.
Man, this is deep. Bet sizing is so much more than just picking some random number. It's about understanding the dynamics of the hand, the pot size, our opponent's tendencies, and our own perceived range.
It really is a complex skill. But once you start to master it, it becomes one of the most powerful tools in your poker arsenal.
Okay, so we talked about c-betting, check-raising, and bet sizing.
Yeah.
Is there anything else we absolutely need to cover when it comes to post-flop play in heads-up?
We could talk about this stuff for hours, but one more thing that's really important is understanding how to exploit your opponent's weaknesses. In heads up, you're playing against the same person hand after hand, so you have a lot more opportunities to pick up on their tendencies and adjust your strategy accordingly.
Okay, so let's say my opponent is a total maniac. They raise every hand pre-flop and bet every street. How do I exploit that?
That's easy. You just wait for a strong hand, let them build the pot for you, and then spring the trap.
So if they raise pre-flop and bet the flop, and turn, I'm just calling with my set and waiting for them to bet the river.
Exactly. You're letting them hang themselves with their own aggression.
Damn, that's pretty satisfying. What about if my opponent is super passive and never bets unless they have the nuts? How do I exploit that?
That one's a little trickier, but you can still exploit their passivity. You can bluff them more often, knowing they're unlikely to call you down without a really strong hand. And you can value bet them thinner, knowing they'll only call with the very top of their range.
So basically, I'm adjusting my aggression level based on their tendencies.
Exactly. If they're aggressive, you play more passively. If they're passive, you play more aggressively.
Dude, it's like a constant chess match, trying to outmaneuver and outthink your opponent.
That's what makes heads-up poker so great. It's a battle of wits, a mental marathon.
Okay, my brain is officially fried. We've covered so much today, from pre-flop strategy to post-flop play, bet sizing, and exploiting weaknesses. Any final words of wisdom before we move on to our next topic?
Just remember, heads-up poker is a complex game with endless possibilities. There's always something new to learn, always a way to improve. The key is to keep studying, keep practicing, and keep experimenting.
Word. Okay, we're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors, and when we come back, we'll be diving into some specific hand examples and analyzing how the pros approach heads-up play. Don't go anywhere. Okay, so we're back. And you know what I always find really helpful is to actually see these concepts in action. So, you send over some hand histories. Let's take a look at a couple of those and you kind of see what lessons we can learn from them.
Yeah, for sure. I think reviewing hand histories is one of the best ways to improve your game. It gives you a chance to really step back, analyze your decisions, and see where you could have maybe made some better choices.
Totally. It's
Yeah.
like having a poker coach right there with you, pointing out your mistakes and showing you how to avoid them next time. All right, so let's jump into this first hand. This is from a $1-2 heads-up match online. We're on the button with king-queen offsuit, and our opponent raises to $6. What do we do?
Okay, so king-queen offsuit on the button. It's a decent hand, but it's probably not strong enough to 3-bet late and heads up. I'd probably just call here and see a flop.
All right, so we call, and the flop comes queen-jack-9 rainbow. Our opponent bets $10 into a pot of 13. What now?
Okay, so we flopped top pair, top kicker, which is a pretty good start. But we got to be careful because this board is pretty coordinated. Our opponent can have a lot of hands that beat us, like a set 2 pair or even a straight draw.
So we shouldn't just jam it in for value.
Not necessarily. Raising is definitely an option, but we need to consider our opponent's tendencies and how likely they are to fold to a raise. If they're aggressive and like to bet a lot of flops, they might not be willing to give up on a hand like ace-queen or king-jack.
So what's the play here? Do we call or raise?
In this spot, I'd probably just call. We're not really sure how strong our opponent is, and calling lets us keep the pot relatively small and see what happens on the turn.
Okay, that makes sense. So we call, and the turn brings a 5, completing the rainbow. Our opponent checks. Now what?
Okay, so a check on the turn could mean a lot of different things. They could have a weak hand and be giving up, or they could have a strong hand and be trying to trap us. It's tough to say for sure.
So how do we figure out what they're up to?
I think we need to consider their previous actions and how they've been playing the hand so far. If they've been betting a lot of flops and turns, a check on the turn is more likely to be a sign of weakness. But if they've been playing passively, a check could definitely be a trap.
Well, in this hand, they've been betting pretty much every street so far.
Yeah, if they've been betting a lot, then their check on the turn probably means they missed the flop and are hoping to see a cheap showdown. I think we should take advantage of that and bet for value here.
Okay, so we bet, and our opponent calls. The river is a deuce, and our opponent checks again. What's the final move?
All right, so the river doesn't really change anything. They're probably still sitting there with whatever weak hand they started with on the flop. I'd bet again for value. They might call us down with a pair of tens or jacks, but we're good a lot of the time.
Okay, awesome. So that's a good example of how to play a hand where we flop top pair in heads up. What are some of the key takeaways from this hand that we can apply to our own game?
I think the biggest lesson here is that we have to be careful about overplaying top pair in heads up. Just because we have a good hand doesn't mean we should be raising every single street. We need to pay attention to the board texture, our opponent's tendencies, and how likely they are to actually fold to our bets.
Yeah, for sure. It's a good reminder that heads up is all about constantly adjusting and adapting to our opponent. We can't just stick to one style of play and expect to win. We need to be thinking, reading our opponent, and making the best decisions based on the information we have.
Exactly.
Awesome, man. Well, that's all the time we have for today's show. Big thanks to you for coming on and breaking down all this heads-up wisdom with us. It's been a blast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
And to all you degenerates listening out there, keep those cards flying high. Remember, aggression is key, but don't forget to use your brains too. And as always, we'll catch you on the next episode of the Romper Room Poker Podcast.
Romper Room, where we ball a break. Big wins, big losses, all at stake. Party vibe, poker life, always crunk. Feel rich, feel broke, that's just the funk, yeah. Seen boys rise, seen boys fall. Bluffing stacks, risking it all. Got the queens, thought I locked the pot. Straight flush flip, now I'm feeling shot. It's the hustle, it's the grind, no time to assume. All in a fold, life in the romper room.